So I want to thank everybody for being here. This is a very important event that we're really glad to have such esteemed speakers here with us, who I will introduce soon. We're going to flip through these slides as I speak because I would love for everybody to get right to the program presentation. Everyone will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint and the recording. Once again, I would like you to ask your questions in the Q&A. Feel free to chat in the chat section, but I will not be looking there for the questions. The first half of this program are the nuts and bolts of board governance. The second half is going to be a panel discussion of good governance and the intersection of racial equity. And I know it's going to be, both halves are going to be wonderful. I would like to start by thanking our presenters and panelists who worked so hard and diligently on this presentation. The amount of time, intelligence, expertise was just overwhelming to me. So I thank Karen Cheeks-Lomax, CEO of My Sister's Place, Thomas C. Rice, co-chair of My Sister's Place, Joan Grangenois Thomas, principal of JGT Public Relations, and a lot more, Maurice Siegel from Pro Bono Partnership, and Judy Siegel from Pro Bono Partnership, who are always there to guide us. So thank you, all of you, for your work around this webinar. A big thank you to NPW's Board of Directors, members, and business sponsors. Together, we are a force for good, we're a force for change, and hopefully we will become an even stronger force to dismantle systems of oppression, which is a positive thing. So without further ado, I would like to encourage all of you to go through the PowerPoint and the slides and read more about the organizations and the people that are here. But I would like to hand this over to Judy and to Mo to begin the presentation on good board governance. And without further ado, Judy and Mo. And you have to just turn on your, you have to unmute yourselves.
Okay, Jan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, it's Mo Siegel, and I'm here with my colleague, although we're not related, Judy Siegel. And thanks to all my panelists and to Jan for this terrific presentation, the opportunity to do it. As Jan said, Judy and I are going to give the first part, the nuts and bolts of board governance. Then we're going to turn it over to our esteemed co-panelists to talk about how it intersects with racial equity. So I'm going to ask you to flip this slide, please. Just a very quick primer on primary corporate governance documents that every organization should be reminded about and that you should have at the ready. One is your certificate of incorporation. Every nonprofit organization, whether you call it a non-stock, a nonprofit, has its birthing document, which we call it the certificate of incorporation. It's the first document filed when the group was organized as a not-for-profit organization. It's a very crucial document because it sets out, among other things, the mission of your nonprofit. And everything that your nonprofit does needs to be related to and tied into that mission. Your website, your tax-exempt application, your marketing materials are all related to what's in the mission in your certificate. So you want to know what it says. If the activities or programs that you're doing are different than what's stated in your certificate, you either need to change your activities or change your certificate of incorporation. Have a copy of that document. Have it looked at by a lawyer periodically to make sure that it still coincides with what your group is doing. You also have, if you're a tax-exempt group under 501c3, an application for tax exemption, which your group filed with the Internal Revenue Service whenever you got tax exemption. That application is also a public document that anybody can ask to see. And it sets out in detail not only your mission, but your programs, your budget, a lot of other information about the group. So you want to look back at that periodically to see that it also coincides with what your group is currently doing. Third, very important governance document are your bylaws. The bylaws are the operating manual for your board. It's not a program document about how you run your programs. It's not personnel policies. It's really the operating manual for your board of directors. How many directors you have, lengths of their terms, whether there are term limits, how you cast votes, whether you have members, which we'll talk about in a second, what kind of committees you have, who your officers are. We spend a lot of time at Pro Bono Partnership reviewing and revising bylaws for nonprofits. Have them, make sure all your board members have them, make sure they are followed. Often they're not. And then that can be an issue if something happens and somebody wants to look at the bylaws to see if they've been followed or not. Have them looked at by us or by other legal counsel periodically to make sure they still coincide with the way you're operating. Bylaws should be a flexible document, so you can change the way you operate and you don't have to necessarily change your bylaws. Finally, there are other important corporate governance documents that groups should have. Every New York nonprofit must have a written conflict of interest policy that comports with New York law. You might also have, and probably should have, a whistleblower policy, a gift acceptance policy, a document retention policy. If you look at the IRS, the Form 990 tax return, the IRS asks if the group has certain of these policies. Even though some of them might not be required, it's good practice to have them. See if you have these corporate governance policies, keep them all in one place. Your board members should have copies of all of these things. Okay, next slide. Why do nonprofits have boards? Judy's going to talk a little bit more about this. But if you look at the bottom of this slide, this really sort of says it all. The buck stops with the board. The organization is run by, managed, overseen by the people that have fiduciary obligations, the board of directors. The board has a very important role with a nonprofit. Board members provide oversight. Board members ensure, the board itself, ensure that the operations, programs, finances, controls, mission are all running smoothly. The board makes sure that charitable resources are being used appropriately and in furtherance of the mission. The board has a very crucial role in most groups to help the financial support and awareness of the organization, to raise money for the organization. Again, Judy's going to talk a little bit more about going to drill down a little bit more about the specifics of these things, but the buck stops with the board. The Pro Bono Partnership, our clients, I think as many of you know, are nonprofit organizations. We provide free legal services to nonprofits, and our client, the body that we answer to, is the board of directors of the organization. And all of your board members really should know what their important obligations are as board members of your organization. Let's go on to the next slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Judy. I just want to talk briefly about this organization chart for nonprofits. Every nonprofit should be organized in the same fashion, whether or not you are tiny with just a board of directors or a large organization with staff and volunteers. So if you look at this flow chart, forget the top block for a minute that says members. Go to the next block that says directors or trustees. Every nonprofit has directors. Some states like New Jersey call them trustees. The directors, then it's a top-down model. Hire and oversee the executive director. Might be called the president, the CEO. Really, if there is a top paid staff person, it could be a volunteer, but that's the executive director, who then hires and oversees the remaining staff and volunteers. Again, you might be a small nonprofit, it might be a new nonprofit, there might not be any staff or volunteers. Perhaps it all starts and stops with the directors. So that would be the second block. I just want to go back for 1 second to that top block, members. There are some nonprofits that have a separate group of people in their governance structure called members, who are akin to shareholders, not shareholders in that they own anything, but that they have essentially voting rights. So groups that have voting members have this top block, and then the members would typically meet, say, once a year, and they will elect the board of directors. Then the board does everything else that the board does. Members, if you have voting members, can also vote on other bigger ticket items, such as dissolution, merger, etc. If your group does not have voting members, you are known as a non-membership organization, and then the board typically elects itself when there are elections. It's called a self-perpetuating board. It's probably more nonprofits than not are self-perpetuating boards, and even groups that are non-membership, and this can be a little confusing, can have people they call members, but not members in the legal sense that get to vote on anything. So you might be say a children's museum or any other number of kind of nonprofit that has people you call members that don't have voting rights, but they're members in that they get maybe admission, they get a newsletter, they get various benefits of being a member without the right to vote. Look in your corporate documents, look in your bylaws. In some states, like Connecticut, it would be in your certificate of incorporation to see if you are a membership organization. The issue that we see with a lot of our clients is that many of them are set up as membership organizations, but they're not operating that way. So if they look back at their documents to see they're supposed to have members, they're not actually having member meetings. And by the way, if you're a membership organization, the criteria for members would be set out in your bylaws. Who qualifies as a member, what the members can vote on, when the members meet. So groups might have members and they're either not following the criteria or they're just not having member votes. What do you need to do if you're in violation of your own bylaws when it comes to members? Either have members and follow your corporate documents, or if you're allowed to, get rid of your membership. We've helped groups do that in the past, where they've sort of voted the members out of existence. And many people who are members of groups, they don't really care to vote. They just want to have a say or feel some connection to the organization. So know how you are structured. Please call us at the partnership if this is something we can help with. My last note before I turn it over to Judy is this. As I said at the beginning of this slide, this is it's supposed to be a top-down model. There are some not well-functioning organizations where it's a bottom-up model. You have instead of the board overseeing and managing the executive director and the staff, it's the executive director who's overseeing the directors and telling the directors what to do. We can tell you a million more stories about this. I'll give you one example. We had a client that had been around for about 40 years, and they had a founder who was the executive director, very strong presence in the community, and the founder retired, and then the board came to us and said, well, now what do we do? We don't know. We were always told what to do by the executive director. Then they had to learn to function as a 40-year-old newbie, so to speak, but how they're supposed to operate with the board. So keep this flow chart in mind in the way a well-functioning nonprofit is supposed to operate. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my terrific colleague, Judy, to talk a little bit more about board duties. Judy?
Thanks, Mo. Okay, next slide, please, Suzanne. So I'm going to start off by saying this is going to be a very high-level discussion in the next half hour of board governance. If you have questions, my contact information and Mo's contact information is at the end of the slide deck. And you may want to consider becoming a pro bono partnership client if you're not already. So please reach out to us. Also, if you're not already a client, you should be emailing one of the two of us so that we can put you on our legal alert list, and you'll be getting information about changes in the law, as well as all our upcoming webinars and presentations. So let's start by talking about the standard by which your conduct as a board member is going to be judged. And it's going to be the reasonably prudent person standard, which is a three-pronged test and fairly straightforward. So it's whether you're expected to use the same degree of diligence, care, and skill which an ordinary prudent person would exercise under similar circumstances in a like position. And there are two ways to look at this. The first is, please don't panic. You do not have to bring to your position as a board member the expertise of the rest of the world. So if we're talking about your review of a financial document, no one expects you to have the ability and knowledge of someone who is a finance major or a CPA or the CFO or controller of a corporation. You have to do what's reasonably prudent. You don't have to have their expertise. But that having been said, you also don't get to walk away from whom you are. You bring yourself with you wherever you go. So you don't get to leave your knowledge at the door. You can't take the position as a reasonably prudent CPA that you're going to be held to that very same standard as someone who has no financial expertise. So you bring who you are with you to the board. Okay, Suzanne. So let's get to the three legal fiduciary duties of a board of director member. And they're pretty basic. So it's the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. And meeting these duties is not really that difficult if you stay informed about your nonprofit's operations and you actively participate in the governance of your nonprofit. So we're going to sort of break these down first from a high level, and then I'm going to get to the practical nuts and bolts of how you're going to do it. So broadest strokes, duty of care. Sorry, my wonderful child just walked by. In terms of duty of care, you're going to stay informed about the organization's business and legal needs, and you're going to take appropriate action if it's required. Just noting a problem is not adequate. You're going to attend board meetings. So you can't just be a board member in name alone because you want your name on that letterhead or you want to be able to tell people you're a board member. You have to attend the meetings. You have to review the documents that you get prior to these meetings. So whether they're governance documents or perhaps a lease or a contract that the board's going to have to vote on, you have to read them, you have to understand them, and you have to be prepared at a board meeting to engage in some meaningful deliberation. No rubber stamping these documents. You have to remember that the job of the board, as Mo said, is to be a big picture strategic thinker. So you have to develop and articulate the mission of the nonprofit within the parameters, please, of your certificate of incorporation. You have to help develop a budget and programs to implement that mission. And you have to remember that your job is not necessarily to be in the weeds and operating that nonprofit. Now, I will put a little star by that one and say that we do realize that many of our clients and nonprofits around the country are small nonprofits that really are run and operated by their boards of directors. But in its truest sense, the role of the board of directors is to be a big picture strategic thinker. So as your nonprofit grows and develops, please remember you have to hand off the micromanaging duty, and please remember your job is to think solely in terms of oversight. Another big picture duty of care job of the board is to manage the nonprofit's risk profile and protect its assets. And we're going to talk about those assets in another minute or two. And then, so that's all big picture, your duty of care. Duty of loyalty is really very simple. It's placing the interest of your nonprofit ahead of your own interests, which means avoiding conflicts that are not in your nonprofit's best interest. And by that, I do not mean avoiding all related party transactions or all conflict of interest transactions when there's some kind of financial give and take between your nonprofit and a member of the board, an officer, or a key person. And I really want to say that what you have to do is disclose those potential conflicts of interest and then have the independent members of your board review them and decide if they're in the best interest of the nonprofit. And please know that transactions between nonprofits and their board of directors members are often advantageous and in fact are in the best interest of your nonprofit. So you're still seeing the one about duty. I'm not sure why you're seeing duty of care only, sorry. Suzanne, maybe click, no, go back to duty of care, back. Okay, so under duty of care, I promise you the slide I'm looking at now says duty of loyalty, but big takeaway on that one is conflicts of interest happen, and they have to happen for the benefit of the nonprofit. And then finally, duty of obedience. All right, just hold it there. Suzanne, go back. All right, hold the slide there, right there, stop. Okay, so duty of obedience in 2 seconds just means ensuring the nonprofit is fulfilling its mission and complying with all applicable laws. And in some states, there's not even this separate duty of obedience. It gets rolled right back up into duty of care. So duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, those are your legal terms for what you need to do. Okay, next slide, please. And now we're going to talk about what you really need to do to make it happen. So let's start with your fiduciary duty of general administration. And that's pretty simple. We're going to start at corporate governance level, which means holding regular meetings to elect officers and directors and carry on the business of your nonprofit. Holding special meetings when necessary to address important issues that come up and require immediate attention. Taking written minutes at your board meetings and recording them properly. So just quickie, please, 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 these are not places where you're supposed to be reflecting your opinions or writing down every syllable that's uttered by every board member. But I want to make sure that you know, not only do you have to take minutes, you must make sure they're adopted. Minutes that have been taken at a board meeting but not adopted by the board are legally irrelevant. They don't exist as a legal document. So please remember that. As Mo said, it's important to have appropriate internal policies based on the needs of your business. One other governance document that Mo didn't mention is that every organization, nonprofit or for-profit in New York State that has even a single part-time employee is legally required to have an anti-discrimination policy, an anti-sexual harassment policy, and you must do annual anti-sexual harassment training. So please don't forget that. There's been no change to that law, even though we all live in a virtual world. So that is corporate governance, which moves us on to legal compliance, which means you need to make sure that you file your state and federal reports and file them on a timely basis. Even though you're a New York State nonprofit, you may have filing requirements in other states, so please keep that in mind. You have to make sure that your corporate governance documents comply with applicable laws. That one warms the cockles of my legal heart. As Mo said, you have to act in compliance with your organization's mission. That's really important. You have to fulfill your grant obligations. You can only use your restricted funds, and in terms of those restrictions, please do not go beyond what you've been given the money for. And seeing how it's now September 24th, which means we are less than 6 weeks away from the election, please, please, please remember you cannot violate the 100% prohibition on engaging in political activity, and you have to be aware of your limits on lobbying. But again, the prohibition on political activity, which is both supporting and opposing a candidate, is 100%. So please don't violate that one. Okay, Suzanne, you are way ahead of me. Go back to finance. Oh, sorry, finance. Okay, which gets us to finance. Now, Mo is my boss, and I'm fairly confident that our executive director, Nancy, is listening in. So I'm going to first start this section on finance by saying we are not financial experts, nor can we give or are we giving financial advice. So with that qualification, I am going to say, okay, sorry, Suzanne, next slide. Thanks. I am going to say that financial literacy is critical. You have to understand what you're looking at in terms of your nonprofit's budget, its income statement, its balance sheet, its projected budgets. And there are so many resources available to help you. Not the least of which, and I recommend this to many of my clients, is that they plan a presentation once a year that is a quick review and financial 101 about this is how you understand and this is what these documents mean. And there is no shame in not knowing what they mean. And if you regularly schedule this meeting once a year, no one has to raise their hand and say, I don't understand, because you've precluded that embarrassing moment by planning this training. The other thing I'm going to suggest to you the other thing I'm going to suggest to you is to go to a website called Investopedia. I refer my mother to it all the time. She's a board member. She is a reasonably prudent person, and she thinks it's wonderful. It has little videos and articles about all different topics related to finance. For those of you who have children in middle school or high school, you can think of it as the Khan Academy of financial literacy, and I highly recommend it to you. But the key takeaway I want you to have when it comes to finances is to remember, while there's no one single way to look at them, what you need to remember is that you should be using them as a tool to shape your conversation as board members around sustainability, and they should be helping you drive programming decisions. The other key takeaway is you need to know that numbers are not static. It is great if you look at your projected budget and you see that you're making less revenue. I mean, that's not great if you're making less revenue, but you recognize that there is a deficit in your revenue. It is not enough just to recognize this variance. You have to explore why you have that variance, and then you need to address it. So again, your finances are the basis for conversation with your treasurer, with your CFO, with your audit committee, with the board as a whole. I don't really care who has this conversation. I care that you have the conversation and recognize your financials as a driving force for your human resource decisions. Are you hiring the right people? Are you retaining the right people? For your staffing composition, are you doing the work you should be doing? Are you doing it appropriately? Do you know what that work is? These are all conversations that should be evolving out of looking at your financial situation and seeing where you're going. So that is my speech on income and balance sheet, which gets us next to internal controls, which are just procedures you're going to put in place to make sure you're protecting your assets. Unless you say to me, oh, we only have a couple of dollars in our bank account, I'm going to tell you, you have other assets you probably haven't thought about. You have donor information. You have credit card numbers. You have fundraising and grant information. You have client information. You have employee information, possibly, including social security numbers, medical information. You have your own confidential financial data. You have stuff you need to control and take care of. And generally, internal controls are broken down into 3 buckets. Preventative controls, so things to prevent things from going wrong. Think of that like checks and balances. So for example, the person who orders supplies isn't authorizing the payment of supplies. You have detective controls, super easy. Think of those as your audit, your monthly checkbook reconciliation. And then finally, you have corrective controls, the 3rd bucket, and these mitigate damages once something has happened. And you would have the easiest example is you're going to back up your data. So if you crash, you can come up, get up and running again, which is going to lead me to just a quick aside on cybersecurity. Please make sure your insurance policies cover cybersecurity. Do not call Mo and I up to ask about that, because we're going to just tell you, you need to be talking to your insurance broker. And as a board, somebody either at the board level or senior staff level should be really having a developed relationship with your insurance broker, because she or he is going to guide you on these decisions. Oh, and also you want to talk about cybersecurity and breaches with your broker, because now that people are working from home, you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate protection. Okay, so next, personnel. Part of satisfying your duty as the board, next slide please, Suzanne. Part of satisfying your duty of the board, your duty of care, is to make sure your business is running efficiently and that the leaders who are in charge of the day-to-day operations are qualified to do their jobs, and that they're working in a way that's in the best interest of the corporation. So how are you going to do that? I'm going to tell you what I tell my clients every day. You are going to be having accurate job descriptions. You're going to be having accurate performance reviews that reflect whether your staff is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of that job description. And if you're on a board, you're going to be the ones who are reviewing senior staff. You're going to make sure there are appropriate employee policies and manuals in place so your employees know what's expected of them. You're going to develop as a board a really good working relationship with your executive director. She or he needs to feel that they can come to the board and discuss concerns. They shouldn't feel that it's going to be punitive, or that she's going to feel that she's going to be viewed as not doing her job if she's identifying situations. Likewise, you have to have a relationship where your executive director is willing to hear constructive criticism. So you need to make sure that there's at least one point person on the board, generally the chair, but sometimes the head of the personnel committee. Again, Mo and I are going to tell you we don't care who that person is. We just care that there's that developed, really relationship based in respect. So the other thing I will say about personnel is, please remember the law changes constantly. It's the most evolving area of the law, and that to the extent that you are concerned about employment law and employee and personnel relationships, you should be on our mailing list for those legal alerts. And it is always important to get good legal advice surrounding employment or personnel decisions, which now is going to take us quickly to issues of program matters. So next slide, please. So program matters, that falls within your fiduciary duties, duty of care, because the decision to come down to, are we going to start a new program? Are we going to merge with somebody? Are we going to be referring people out to another organization that maybe does the work better or more cost effectively or more cost efficiently? Ultimately will rest with the board, because that is a big picture strategic decision. And how are you going to come to terms with that decision? You're going to go back to your financial conversations. So you're going to know about what's happening in your neighborhood, what's happening within your sphere, the things you're working in, and you're going to look at whether or not programming, whether you're going to move forward with a new program or eliminate a program, is in line with your organization's mission. And again, I'm going to refer you back to your certificate of incorporation, because you may have identified the most pressing need in your community. But if, for example, your certificate of incorporation says that you are going to operate a food pantry or a soup kitchen, and you recognize that shelter is an equally or more important requirement in your community, you can't do that if your certificate of incorporation only says you're authorized to provide food or address food insecurity. As Maurice said, we can amend that certificate of incorporation for and with you, but you as a board need to be aware of the parameters of what you can do. You need to be looking at the cost of that program. And I will say there are situations where clients have said to me, we're going to lose money on this, but we're okay because another area in which we work funds it and has cash, has cash overflow where they're very in the black on that area. So we're going to roll the extra funding over into this program, which we know is going to be a loser financially, but is critical to what our mission is and who we are. That's great. I don't have a problem with that because the board has come to me after having really thought through this, looked at their finances, looked at their mission, and really made a concerted, well-formed, and informed decision about what they want to do. You're going to look at who the program benefits. Remember, a great program that only helps 2 people may not be as beneficial to your nonprofit as an okay program that benefits 200. Again, that decision is not for me to make as your lawyer, but that I would say if you called me was, has your board thought it through? Have they analyzed it? Have they thought about this in terms of the numbers? It all comes down to really considered decision making. And finally, I would really urge you to reevaluate and look at all your programming at least once a year in terms of your financials, in terms of the optics, in terms of the needs of your community. That is part of your job as a board member. We're doing well. And then finally, in terms of public relations and community relations, please remember that you are a walking, talking model of your nonprofit. You are the role model and you are who the public sees as a board member. So please remember that you're walking the walk and talking the talk. And when I say that, it is really critical to remember that boards act as a group. So you're going to go to your board meeting and you're going to have vigorous discussion about an area. And then you're going to have a board vote. And I don't care if you've decided to vote against an action your board is taking, but once the board takes that action, that is the action of the board and you stand by that action. So there is no running around behind the scenes saying, well, the board voted to do X, but I voted against it because I thought we should be doing Y. That is not your job. I will also point out that what happens in the board level is confidential and it should remain confidential. There is no telling secrets out of the classroom or out of the boardroom. So please remember that as well. And I am sorry if I'm being scoldy about this, but it does cause problems. You want to make sure that you're really out there communicating to the public what you do, why you do it, and why it's important. And to that end, I would say each and every one of you who's a board member or even works at a nonprofit should be able to do the 2-minute elevator pitch. I promise you that if you woke me up in the middle of the night and asked me what Pro Bono Partnership does, I could tell you that we provide free legal services to over 900 nonprofits in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. We did 25,000 hours of free legal work last year, valued at over $10 million. And we have over 1,400 of the greatest volunteers out there who give their time and their knowledge on a daily basis. Truly, I think my kids may have even have tested this when they've woken me up in the night. You should be able to do the same. But please also remember that just because you're a board member does not mean your free speech rights have been smothered. You can say what you want to say, but please remember to make sure you're making it clear that you are doing it in your own personal capacity and not speaking on behalf of your nonprofit or your board of directors unless you've been explicitly authorized to do so. So that gets to that. And now we're going to get to the heart, I think, of why everyone is here. So next slide. And we are going to talk about the intersection of governance and racial equity. And I think it's really, really important to understand that when you're dealing with issues of racial equity, you should think about those in terms of being just a part of your legal and fiduciary duty as a director. So just think back to 10 minutes ago or so when we were talking about broad strokes fiduciary responsibilities, and you're going to see that many of the things that you're legally tasked with doing, big picture thinking, preserving your assets. And when I say assets, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about human capital and goodwill. I'm talking about protecting against risk, and that risk can include potentially shrinking funding dollars for failing to address issues of racial equity. I'm talking about losing your most qualified personnel or failing to recognize who's the best choice for a role. I'm talking about failure to diversify your hiring policies or diversify your staff. because they are actually the people who are affecting the nature and impact of your programming. Every single one of these things implicates issues of racial equity and implicates your duty of care. So I want to also say that I'm framing this as an issue of racial equity and not as diversity, equity, inclusion, because I was counseled by Karen Cheeks-Lomax, who I am honored to say is our client. But Karen explained to me that saying, and you're so lucky to be learning from her and Tom, who was also my client, and I'm blessed to have gotten to know him. But I want to make clear that Karen explained to me that this is not a question of inclusion, because no one should want to be included in a biased system. That should not be our goal. It should be to strive for equity and equality, not to strive for getting stuck into a broken system. So that is why I'm going to talk about this in terms of equity, and I thank Karen for teaching me, because this old dog still has a lot of new tricks to learn. So as I set the table for Karen and Tom's discussion, I want to do so by highlighting some of the findings in a really important 2019 study called Race to Lead Revisited. And I believe you'll have the link to that or the reference to that and some other really good tools at the end of the slide deck. But Race to Lead Revisited was a 2019 study of about 5,000 people working in the nonprofit sector. And I'm not going to rehash the findings of the 50-page study for you, so don't worry. I'm going to let you read that by yourself. But I do want to talk about how these directly implicate good board governance and fiduciary duties. So just one of the sets of findings in Race to Lead was that while people of color are similarly qualified to hold senior positions, and that in fact, these people of color want to hold ED or other senior positions more frequently than their white peers. And also that the populations that these nonprofits are serving are people of color. People of color hold leadership positions in significantly smaller percentages than their white peers in nonprofits. So what does this mean for us in terms of governance? Well, it means a lot of things. It means that boards are discounting huge numbers of qualified and possibly more qualified candidates. So this is going to talk to preserving your assets, overseeing senior levels of staff, and employing the most qualified people. And it's also talking about disenfranchising or not choosing to utilize those people with the most experience and possibly the most relevant knowledge about how to best serve your population. You need some cultural awareness in order to really know what you're doing. And I say that as someone who has a current client tell me once in very kind words, but basically was telling me, check your privilege, little white girl, you don't know what you're talking about, as I sat on a grants committee for a nonprofit that addressed food insecurity. And she was 100% right, and I was 100% wrong as I was questioning the choice of food, because I did not take any consideration into the fact that different populations may choose to eat or not eat different foods. So you want to talk about a board member not knowing what she was doing and not being sensitive to an issue? That was me. So, okay, there are other salient findings in Race to Lead that relate to governance. And these are terms of preservation of assets and senior level hires. So we learn in Race to Lead because it divided organizations into three categories: white run organizations, organizations led by people of color, and this sort of wonky third category, all other, which we're going to disregard for now. And we find in the study that both people of color and white people reported the least positive experiences working for white run groups. And both people of color and white respondents reported far better experiences in people of color-led groups. And these numbers are pretty stark. So the data showed that more than half of the survey takers reported working for organizations in which less than 25% of their board members are people of color. So just tuck in the back of your mind, we've got some gatekeeper issues going on here. And similarly, 58% of the respondents reported that their organization's top leadership was less than 25% of color, even though more than half of the communities they were serving were people of color. So this intrinsically suggests that the board should be fulfilling its fiduciary duties by recruiting and retaining racially diverse staff and board leaders. Oh, this is my last slide on this, don't worry. We're just going to talk and then you get Karen and Tom. You're really going to be excited. But this gets to the impact and appropriateness of your programming, your duty of care, and your hiring policies, all big picture goals. And in case you still aren't convinced that racial equity and good governance are just opposite sides of the same coin, consider these reactions in the study. In response to the statement, I would be happy if I worked at this organization 3 years from now, Respondents of color in white-run organizations had an average level of agreement of 5.4, contrasted with 7.1 for their white colleagues. But both people of color and white respondents working in people of color-led organizations had a 7.5 level of agreement to that statement. So everybody is very happy, or happier, when they're working for organizations that are run by people of color. And you see the same results in terms of, are the people as likely to stay in the organization 3 years from now? And respondents who are in organizations led by people of color were much more positive about this. And in fact, the average response of people who say they feel they have a voice in their organization was 5.8 in white-run groups compared to 8.5 in groups led by people of color. And the pattern continues throughout the study. So my last pitch for why governance is issues focuses on research done on the issue of capacity building, which 100% gets to your job of your fiduciary duty of care. So capacity building gets to strategic planning, it gets to growth, it gets to sustainability, all 100% parts of your board duty of fiduciary duty of care. And so there's a great article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, written by, among others, View Lee, who writes the blog Nonprofit AF. And the suggestions in this article, applicable to issues of equity in board composition and leadership and ultimate effectiveness of the organization, speak about effectively coming up with programming goals, and the best way to do that are by building culturally resonant relationships amongst the people who work for the nonprofit, the board members, and the population that's being served. So I'm going to conclude with by asking yourself to ask this question: why have we failed so miserably to fulfill our board duties? And Race to Lead has an answer to that question. And they say the lack of diversity in the nonprofit sector was not a reflection of qualifications or ambitions of people of color, but the result of racialized barriers that inhibited leadership ambition, from lack of support by white boards of directors and to the biases of executive recruiters. The issue is one of gatekeepers, implicit bias, and a failure to examine hurdles to movement that are not warranted. To increase diversity of nonprofit leaders, the study found, they recommend the sector shift its focus away from individual qualifications or goals of emerging leaders and instead focus on addressing systemic bias in the sector that prevents people of color's advancement. So as I turn it over to Karen and Tom, I really urge you as board members and as senior staff levels to do the right thing, not just because you should, but also if you're a board member, because I'm telling you, it is your legal fiduciary duty. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Karen, and I am so excited that we're going to get to learn from them.
Thank you so much, Judy. And as we transition to their presentation, the ongoing journey to racial equity, my sister's place and Karen Cheeks Lomax and Thomas C. Rice really have been so generous in sharing their journey, their ongoing journey to racial equity. It's not something that you do overnight or even in a few weeks or years. And we are so lucky to have Joan Granois Thomas with us to facilitate this conversation, and special thanks to Judy and Mo for being part of the journey we have all taken in coming up with this presentation. There are some questions that were answered in the that were asked in the Q&A. I think they're going to be answered in the presentation. If not, I will ask them at the end. Suzanne, if you could go onto the guiding principles from my sister's place. So a lot of what you're going to hear from Karen and Tom's presentation is really based on their guiding principles. They came up with these guiding principles as part of their journey. You can continue, Suzanne. And I'm going to hand it over now to Joan. I'm going to keep track of some questions. I'm going to encourage all of you, again, this presentation will be sent to you to really look it over and see the incredible job that My Sister's Place has done in this journey, and to look at the resources that nonprofit Westchester has compiled for you to read. I want to remind people that the co-director of the Race to Lead will be presenting at the Nonprofit Summit of United Way this year. And I also want to remind this audience that the YWCA of Central Westchester is launching their Center for Racial Equity in partnership with all the amazing work that has been done by many groups previous to this. But with that, Joan, Karen, Tom, this is yours now, and I, again, can't thank you enough for this.
Well, thank you, Jan. That was a terrific intro. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Judy for her comments about public relations and communications for board members. Thank you so much for what I do. That's certainly something that, I talk to my clients about often, that board members are representatives and are out there speaking on behalf of the organization, and should be ready with that 2-minute, 90-second, whatever level elevator speech that we have. And so thank you very much for that, Judy. And to Tom and to Karen, thank you so much for joining us on this event. I want to, as Judy said, to sort of set the table, have you set the table for us in terms of your journey. But Judy and Mo also advised us that we should have disclaimer. And so on behalf of our audience, the disclaimer that we want to offer you before we embark on this discussion is that the issue of race is never an easy issue to discuss. It is complicated. And it often brings up a level of discomfort for many people. And it is in that discomfort that learning, that growth is accomplished. And so our goal today is to have a conversation that leads you to that learning. We're lifting up My Sister's Place as an example of an organization that has taken on the tough work of making sure that race is centered in their mission statement. You've seen their guiding principles, that it is woven into everything that they do, from the board level to the staff level as well. And so there may be language, there may be things that we say that make you feel uncomfortable, but I would challenge you to lean into that discomfort and try to understand what it means and why it's happening. And so to start us off, again, as I mentioned, would love to have either Karen or Tom help set the table for us. Help us understand the genesis of this journey that My Sister's Place is on in terms of centering race and racial equity.
Sure. So again, I want to thank everyone for this opportunity. I think it's extraordinary that we're having these kinds of conversations, given all that's happened in our world. Before I move forward, I do want to acknowledge Breonna Taylor and all that we've now just seen about that particular case. I also want to talk about, George Floyd and those experiences that we've had over the last several months, and certainly all of the other people that have come before. And the list is endless. We would not even have enough time to begin to have those conversations, but I just want to, that's part of setting the table, right? Because what has happened in this country to people of color, and I'm talking about Black and Brown and Indigenous people, is a consequence of race and racism and the construct of race. And so when Joan asked me, set the table, how did you get here? What are those experiences that have gotten you here? It's the mere fact that I am a Black woman, right? But I want to just kind of give you if I can, there's so much, it's so rich, it's so textured, but I will give you the first bit of information that my mother, who's watching today, shared with me. And of course, this thing always rings when I'm talking, right? My mother told me when I was a little girl, she said, guess what? You're going to have to work harder, twice as hard, or 3 times as hard as your white counterpart, even though you're smarter than them. And those were her words that resonated with me as I traveled every path, whether it was college, it was, graduate school, it was law school, being the CEO at my sister's place, being the general counsel. Those words have always rung true. She also said that she just instilled with me this work ethic. And so I say, Mom, thanks today, because you see where I've landed, and everything that you said was true. But what I wanted to share with you was that was race and racism 101. I didn't know. She didn't name it that. But she put me on a path that said, you can do this because you're smart and you're capable. I would say somewhere around 2011, 2010, I had taken a course at Sarah Lawrence College, and it was Undoing Racism. And I have to tell you, I came out of that class just feeling overwhelmed by the sadness and grief as I began to understand race and racism and the social construct of race, and the analysis that many of us who were sitting in this room may have learned there, but may have learned in other places. But it was so validating for me that every time that course was offered, I took it. So I've probably taken it about 5 or 6 times. And every time I walked away from that course, I learned something different. But it was validating for me as a Black woman, because I had never understood. I understood the feelings. I just didn't know the words or the language that accompanied the devalued feeling, the invisible ness of my position, of my Blackness. And so I was just struck by that, and I wanted everyone to understand that. And as a leader at my sister's place, in 2013, I had the opportunity to get a grant. I was on, I had been a member of the Leadership Westchester class of 2013. I graduated in 2013, and we had an opportunity to get a $10,000 grant. So everybody was writing their grants, and I wrote mine to support Undoing Racism, because I felt like if we all could begin on this journey to just kind of be on a path where the language was the same, that we were really understanding racism for what it is, for what it was, what it has been, the historical context of race and racism in this country, then we could maybe begin to change and be more transformative. So in 2013, I got a $10,000 grant, and every drop, every dime of that grant was used over maybe a year and a half to send my sister's place staff to Undoing Racism. I continued pushing because I think as boards, we talked a little bit about boards, Judy and Mo, and I'm so appreciative of hearing that those assets are people, right? The decision-making around the people who work for you, and the strategy that has to include a community of color who's coming in for services. So the leadership should look like the community of color that we're supporting. It's the same thing with, that funders ask boards to do. They say, well, how many folks of color or how many people on your board represent the people in the community? So we have to be conscious of that. So I'm appreciative of that. So in 2014, I really pushed and said, I'm doing grassroots work, and I know people thought on the board it was Karen's work, and I needed to bring it more central to the agency because I really felt it was the right thing to do. And so in 2014, the board put a very hefty, significant amount of money aside so that the board could be part of this. We did, I forget what we called it, was a primer. We did a session with the board for about 4, it's fine, it's fine. You see, everybody gets interrupted on these things, sorry.
That's life, that's our life now.
Yeah, Jayla. Okay, doors open, everything. Okay, so I'm sorry. so they decided that they were invested. And that's what I think we should also be talking about with boards. They were invested in what felt like it was Karen's work, but they began to think, you know what, we need to be part of this too. So they supported doing the Undoing Racism, and they also spent money for the entire staff, our entire staff, to go to that training. And then we began to think, well, how are we going to change internally as an organization? We put together an anti-racist committee, and then we began to have, you know, internal conversations, and we realized we needed more, because as new staff come in, everyone is not at the same place. As new board members come in, everyone is not at the same place. And I think one of the most critical aspects of this work is to ensure that everyone is almost on the same page, that they're aligned, that they at least understand what came before them. So in 2016, we embarked on a strategic plan, and most of us know strategic plans help us to kind of think, where are we going as an organization? And we kind of plan out, 18 months, 2 to 3 years, 5 years, et cetera. And part of that strategic plan, I said, had to include race and racism, because that was, for me, center. And our clients who are experiencing systemic racism, and our staff who are experiencing systemic racism, we had to lift it up so that everybody was really understanding, including the board, what those experiences were or what those experiences are. So that came, our strategic guiding principles that I think you talked about and Judy talked about, came out of the strategic plan. And I have to just tell you that because we had been doing that work for so many years, we had those strategic principles, guiding principles, came from the board, members who are on our strategic planning committee, and they also came from our staff. I was not on that committee. This was generated, I kid you not, in a day and a half.
Wow.
People were so clear, because we had been doing this deep work about what they wanted the agency to be. Now, I will tell you, this is one of the hardest things we've ever done, because the principles are lovely. We framed them all, and we put them in our respective offices, and we shined the glass. The real thing is that they have to be living and breathing. And so that's the work that we're doing right now with My Sister's Place, with our teams, with the board of directors. And honestly, I'm very proud of it, because everybody doesn't start at the same place. Everybody doesn't finish. And we don't want to throw people away. What we want to do is, as an organization, make sure that we get everybody on board. We give them the tools that they need so that we can begin to look at how we get to that place. And there's so many variations on the theme, but I think when you think about hiring, when you think about your social networks, when you look at board diversity, who's coming on the board, community members coming on the board, when you can pull back and let go of the traditional perspectives, traditional views that Race to Lead talks about. Race to Lead, if you haven't read it, you have to really sit down and read it. It's so obvious. And people of color, Black and brown and indigenous people, they not only want to lead, they can lead. They're your best leaders. They're coming at it with a lens that is relevant to what's happening in our world today. So I thank you for that. I just wanted to give you how I got here.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I think you've expressed very well how important it is that there is a starting point, right? That not just the staff, but the board, that everybody sort of needs to be on board with this process, and that you're starting from a common place. There's still different interpretations of it, right? But that you're starting at a common place that you can join together and discuss from that point on. And so thank you for that, Karen. And so Tom, tell us more about the individual work that you needed to do. I've heard you quoted as saying, Karen insisted and I resisted. So tell us more about that and the journey that you're on.
So yeah, let me do that. And I'm sorry that I've been quoted that way, because it's accurate, but not something I'm particularly proud of. But look, first let me start with, I think Karen would confirm that for the beginnings of this work, I was all in. I mean, I come from a background where, I worked for 40 years at a law firm, which really does value and did a lot of work in terms of diversity and inclusion. And as management, I was quite, involved and invested in, hiring, retaining, and promoting people of color. So the early stages of this, the idea of it, the theory of it was, as Karen talked about, I was all in. I mean, I went to the board training that she talked about with the People's Institute in or about 2014. I enthusiastically said, I love our, our guiding principles, including our anti-oppression, anti-racist. But for me, where I resisted to get to that point was, and it really happened about a year ago, where I started to become concerned and express the concern that our anti-racism work, particularly at the board level, was almost becoming a new mission. And it was separate and apart and really from our, anti-domestic violence and anti-human trafficking work. And I expressed that. I mean, I think I first expressed it, let me back up. We had started as a board at the beginning of last year. Karen and I and our other co-chair decided we would devote a portion of each meeting to talking about issues of race. And we decided we would do that by readings, by doing different readings. And I think for me, I became uncomfortable. I guess I know it's a good thing, but it's quite uncomfortable anyway. But I became most uncomfortable when we, at mid last fall, decided that we would read and talk about the New York Times 1619 Project. And I started to, and the discussions were long. That discussion, predominated a board meeting that we try to keep to an hour and a half. And I started to ask the question publicly, well, how does this really tie to our work, right? How does this relate to our work? And then privately, as Karen knows, I started to express to Karen my concern that we were going beyond what I thought was an appropriate board function. We'll come back to, I've learned a lot from Judy and Mo, over the course of the prep for this and today. But I thought our role as it related to racial equity was really twofold. One, to be a more diverse board. I mean, we have thankfully some great board members, who are people of color, but they're just under 25% of the board. So we're one of those, race to lead, white controlled boards, at least. Not I think with Karen as our CEO, we're hardly a white controlled organization. But I firmly understand and I firmly believe that, through diversity, there's greater wisdom. And I think one of the things that I've been committed to, and I think the board is committed to, is trying to become more diverse than we are now. And then secondly, I thought our role as a board was to support My Sister's Place staff as they were trying to carry out kind of our mission, including, to provide services in an anti-racist, anti-oppressive way. And I kind of felt like we'd done that. Anything management had asked for, we'd given them, from trying to help salaries at the lowest level, people who were, so they could have a living wage, in adopting the guiding principles, in authorizing money for training of staff so that they could do things better. So I kind of felt like we did it, but I felt like, and I expressed to Karen that I thought that, as I said, I thought the discussions we were having at the board were not closely enough connected to our work, were too heavily focused on race. And that's what I said to her, so I'm saying it here. And I said that because our anti-oppressive guideline talks about other things too, right? Ageism, ableism, et cetera. And we weren't really focusing on that. And I was concerned that we were taking up, maybe being protective of the board a little bit, that we were taking up too much time. So, and I really did, Joan, I believe those things, but I have come to also understand, I think that I was reacting to some of the discomfort that I was personally feeling, right, with the notions that I was a beneficiary of white privilege, or that otherwise I somehow, was a contributor to institutional racism, or if not actively contributing, a beneficiary for it. And I in part, I took umbrage to that because I come from, right, and you don't need to hear a lot about my background, but I come from a pretty humble background, right? And, where I always believed that, like, what my mother told me wasn't founded in race, but she told me I needed to work, harder than anybody else if I was going to succeed. And I did. And I always felt that through hard work and a little bit of fortuitous circumstances, I was able to get by. And therefore, when people said, I benefited because I was a white man in the system, I had a hard time kind of accepting that. So that's really that's really where I was. And so Karen and I had a number of conversations, over breakfast, over in a meeting in her office, over the telephone, about what are we doing, with my view being we're spending too much time on this. We should take a break from it, I think I probably said at some point in time, and visit it from time to time. But it's something that we should kind of slow down on, and with Karen insisting that we should go forward. So that's really where I was. I can tell you where I've come since then, but I don't know if I should stop here and
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, and that's remarkable, and it actually leads me to ask the question about your relationship, right? Yours and Karen's relationship, in terms of the roles that you have. We're seeing the elephant in the room in terms of visual, white man as the board chair, sort of then dictating, if we're talking about that top-down process, to Black woman.
Yeah,
Let's talk about that. How did that impact your relationship?
So let's first talk about it. I think Karen would tell you, I don't think I ever dictated anything, nor could I. Karen would find, even when I was saying, let's slow down, I think at every board meeting, somehow we got into matters of race. And that's because Karen is kind of the strong, committed person that she is. But I think it's fair to say, and Karen and I talked about this really expressly for the first time just the other day, that it was a strain on our relationship. I mean, one of the many things I've enjoyed about My Sister's Place, I mean, it's people generally, but Karen in particular. And while we're not personal friends in the sense that we see each other socially, I enjoy every minute that I spend with her on both a professional and personal level. And we've had opportunities to have dinner, right, where we talk about, My Sister's Place business. And so that part of our relationship, I think I felt strained. We still would meet and talk, I think, about as frequently, but we probably we didn't talk as much about this issue as we should be talking about. And instead, her knowing my position, she knowing mine, saying we need to talk about it further, but not really having, spoken about it. So and for me, it was a hard time. I told Karen the other day, I wondered whether I could lead, and I lead only in the sense that I chair kind of a great board of directors, and I get to talk to Karen, about the organization of My Sister's Place and all of its great work. But I wondered whether I could continue to lead and stay on the board, in all honesty, if we were going in such different places. Now, I'm in a different place today, which I'm happy to talk about at some point, but that's in terms of how it affected the relationship. I think that's how it affected it. But Karen, I'm interested in your perspective, and I hope you'll tell them I can't tell you what to do, and I never have.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective, Karen.
Karen, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's funny, just kind of hearing Tom talk about and reminisce about, I can give you the exact date. It was January of 2019 when we began to kind of hit those choppy, rough waters. And, it's the same thing for me as I'm leading. If I was oblivious to it, or I just said, I'm not going to do it, I don't want to talk about race, I don't think that plays a role here at My Sister's Place, then I would have not had a problem with it, but that's not who I am. The whole concept of 1619, and actually Tom had read 1619 that Sunday in that Sunday Times, and had said to me at one point, hey, maybe we can do 1619. And that really blossomed into, oh, why are we doing this? Because if those of you that read the paper or listened to the podcast, it's historical.
Mhm.
And it's capturing, it's profound, and it really, if you're going to do this work, you have to recognize the construct of social, the social construct of race and how we got here. I remember when Tom said we should take a break, and my reaction was, I don't get to take a break. I walk out here every day as a Black woman, and I'm confronted by the kinds of things that, you know, we all, some of us know, but, you know, I will just share this with you. I am invisible to many people who are looking for a white CEO. When I go places, and Tom and I have talked about this, they will take my colleague and say, oh, you must be Karen Cheeks Lomax, because they are not clear that I could be the CEO of this organization. I was telling Tom earlier, and this is, you know, nowhere near our current board, and I would want to say here publicly that I think we have an extraordinary board. And I think just like any change, any culture shift, you have to, you know, it's transformative. So it takes a minute to get there. But I remember when I was being considered for this position, all this many years ago, it's over 18 years ago, and there were some board members who were mostly very supportive, but there was a decision to do a search in the New York Times. And, you know, those of you who remember, you used to look in the one ads in the New York Times. Obviously, we don't do that anymore. Very, very expensive. And I remember feeling like, I had been general counsel for 5 years, so you know who I am. And I had been highly recommended by my predecessor and several board members. But the decision, you know, was to do that, which invisibilized me, but also made me say, okay, if they choose me, well, they've done their due diligence, but they could have done their due diligence by interviewing me and not thinking they could get somebody else who was white. That's what that decision was. And so I was sharing it with Tom, and he knew nothing about it. You know, this is many, many years ago. But those are the experiences. That's what Race to Lead is talking about. Race to Lead is saying, be open, you know, be able to appreciate and understand that there is this expertise and tech, you know, in leading, this creativity in leading that looks different. It may look different to you, but it doesn't mean that it's not the right choice. And so I think as I talk to so many of you out there, you have to think about leading, and you have to think about not taking a chance on someone, but being clear, we need this diversity. We need someone different to meet this community where they are, because guess what? They look like the community. So when Tom said, you know, when Tom and I had this conversation, it did create tension. We were very candid with each other the other day, and I'm appreciative of that, because he was uncomfortable. And I kept saying to him in our conversations, I gave him reading. You know, I had given the board a list of books to read, and it was hard for me, because I said, I can't lead unless I have a board that's leading with me. We are collaborative. You know, our guiding principles say we're collaborative. We are advocates, we're client-centered, all of those wonderful things that I'm telling you, we have so much work to do. I felt like if I wasn't partnering with the board of directors, I couldn't do it. And it made me wonder, you know, how do I do that in the long run? So I think we got to a good place.
And I correct me if I'm wrong, but your predecessor was a white woman?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And how long have you been with the organization?
So Julie DeMacos had been with the organization for about 6 years. She hired me as general counsel and recommended me as her successor. And so, you know, even with that, you know,
right.
We went outside of that because we weren't sure. I'm just going to lay it out there that I, as a Black woman, could run this organization in the same way.
And Tom, how long have you been on the board at My Sister's Place?
It's 2012, so I guess 8 years at this point, and I've been co-chairing the board. This is my 3rd year co-chairing.
Gotcha. And so one of the things, again, that Judy pointed to in the Race to Lead report was this notion that, there was some prevailing theory that there was a need to train and convince people of color to step into leadership. And when they, continued on with the research, they found that that was not the case, right? We just heard in the news yesterday, Wells Fargo CEO saying that the Black talent pool is limited. And so, but we know that that's not the case. The case, it's about, where you go to look for talent, right? You mentioned the New York Times. That's not necessarily the place that you're going to find people of color in terms of talent. We know we have to sort of go outside of those areas. And so the Race to Lead report said the same. It was talking about the board as being, the board and recruiting firms, search firms being the hurdle to finding and retaining good and talent. So have you experienced that in your process?
I don't think my sister's place is a unique thing, right? Because for all of my time, Karen has been, right, our CEO, and we, as you can see from the chart, right, that Judy put up, right? I mean, we basically supervise is not the right word, but we basically, hire Karen, and we understand what she's doing, and we talk about it. But really, I think my sister's place, which is predominantly, right, people of color at all levels, I think because of Karen's leadership, we haven't really, even though we're a white-led board, I don't think we have the kinds of promotion issues. I mean, I do think in the future, right? I mean, one of the reasons we need to get more diverse is because, at some point we may not have, right, a Black, woman CEO in the organization. And we really want to be sure that we are, as racially, equitable as we can be. So, hey, I hope, Joan, you'll let me at some point tell you where because Karen and I are no longer in conflict on these issues, and I would hope you let me just talk. Can I talk just for a minute about really what's happened?
Sure. Yeah, we have a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, I'll be quick. I mean, it really is. I mean, Karen talked about, a reading list, and one of the things I did do, because I was obviously, as I thought about the process, was start to read. And I started with a book called White Fragility that some of the white staff had mentioned. I moved on to a book Karen recommended, Dear White America. And being a lawyer, I started to read things about our criminal justice system. I think I started with a book a lot of people have read called The New Jim Crow, but I read more. There's a Harvard book called The Collapse of the Criminal Justice System. And I think really through that and through talking to friends, talking to my children, talking to my wife, I started to realize that I was uncomfortable because there was reason for discomfort. And therefore, I came to Karen, I think last year, just before our final board meeting, and said, I'm there, and I think she was probably a little distrustful. She said, I think I'm going to hold you to that. When I told her, I'm there in terms of continuing this work even at the board level. And I got there because I really not for all the legal reasons that Judy's put up, but because I thought that if we as a board are going to be leading an organization which is comprised of people of color and serves people of color who all live in a system of racial inequality, that we needed to understand that better if we were going to be able to make kind of wise and right decisions for the organization. So that's the way I thought about it, and also to show the people that work for us by our leadership, right, that we were committed to the same thing they were. Frankly, for me, it was getting in part comfortable that it was consistent with my fiduciary duty. I'm now understanding from Judy and Mo's work, and absolutely makes great sense that when we think about protecting assets, meaning our people first and foremost, when we think about our duty of care, right, and understanding how the programs work and are they working well, I need to understand implicit bias, that this work is really an important part of what we need to do. And therefore, at this June meeting, I sort of came clean with our board and with some of the senior staff was there about kind of where I was and where I think I am now and where I think we should go. And so happily, that's kind of the ending of at least at the ending. That's the present status of kind of my journey.
And so, and certainly your learning does not stop at my sister's place, right? These are learnings and revelations and growth that you can bring to your community, wherever that may be, home, school, work, church, and it's that individual work that I think is very important that we have to do before we can even begin to understand and grow and learn. We have to look at ourselves and our own biases and our own different social communities that we move in to understand how we might even be perpetuating systemic racism in a variety of ways. Yeah,
sorry, I'm looking at the time and I just wanted to answer the question that you had put in front of us around the Race to Lead survey.
Yeah.
One of the things that they talked about was the connection, and thank you, Tom, for sharing that. One of the things they talked about was the connection of boards being isolated from communities of color, all white boards. In addition, that lacking that social network means that you don't, elevate other kinds of people to your board. The other thing they talked about was the fact that young black people, didn't want to lead, and I think, as you pointed out, they were chomping at the bit to lead, and it just isn't true. I wanted to say that the notion that people of color have to take certification classes, and I think that was in there as well. It was a special class, like you're going to take an executive class on learning how to do this, executive class of learning how to do that. Again, was a gatekeeper way to keep people who are extraordinarily able and well prepared.
Right.
They can't get through it. Oh, wait, we need a certificate, an executive certificate around blah, blah, blah. So I think that if people haven't read it, it's one of when I first read it, I was like shaking my head the whole time because it really represents what happens. And it also represents, I'll say one more thing, when you have white senior leadership and when you have white middle manager leadership, you often do not get that pushing up in promotions. I've asked my entire team to go to historically black colleges. We are looking at different sites. We have a list of different sites that we're going on. Obviously, the New York Times was practically 20 years ago.
Right.
Again, it was a certain candidate that would come out of that particular look. So I just wanted to say that we are pushing our middle managers who say, I don't really know anybody. And we're saying, okay, here are the places that you need to look to find candidates that will be appropriate for this agency. So that's one of the things that we can do for diversification.
Wonderful. And I think Jan is giving me looks here that we need to move along so that we might be able to take a couple of questions from the audience. Is that correct, Jan?
Yes. So first of all, thank all of you. This has been incredible. And Joan, what a way to go to manage such a great conversation.
We could go on for much longer, I'm sure.
And we spoke about doing a part 2 because I see a number of the questions really focus on board diversity. How do you diversify the board? And the board, how to make the board itself more diverse. Our communities are so segregated that our white board members rarely know any people of color to recruit. That's one of the questions. And again,
Jan, can I butt in for 2 seconds here?
Sure.
I just want to say that there are some models, mostly you see it in the affordable housing model, there's federal funding coming in, and they require 1/3 of the board to be from the community. And that is where we're seeing an influx of community members in some of our clients. We see it coming in through there, and yes, the board sometimes needs to do more training to get everyone on the same page. But I think it's an interesting model. I also have another client that is based in Yonkers, and they've always have a give or get. And I know that some people think that can be an impediment to have. And for those of you who don't know, you either have to donate so much money or get other people to donate money if you're sitting on the board. And that can, in fact, be a barrier to board service. And my client has very thoughtfully thought of alternative ways to look at the give. So I think there are ways that can be shaped so that you can really move that ball along.
Yeah, and that does point to the fact that, yes, you're talking about people in the community, and I think we primarily think about them as service recipients. What about, Tom and Karen, people on the board who are Black and brown people of color who are being viewed through a white lens, and there are biases there? How do we break down those biases? How do we bring people onto the board who are, in every way, professional communities and people within the community itself? That seems to be the common thread here, and maybe even part of a whole other webinar about what do you do to dismantle, the systemic racism that results in all white boards and all white boards saying, we really want to diversify, but there are no Black or brown people that are qualified. There are no Black or brown people that would fit into our culture. I feel it's a whole other topic in and of itself, but I think with closing, and we're at 1:30, I give you guys, Karen and Tom and Joan, the last word, and I just want to thank you all. Mo and Judy, the level of expertise and support of Pro Bono Partnership is amazing, and the three of you, again, amazing. So with that, board diversity, ladies and gentlemen, somebody want to close that out?
Well, I guess I'll start on board diversity. It is, I think, the question about identifying, right, when you have an all-white board, how do you identify, appropriate minority candidates? And I think it is any way you can. One of our people of color is someone who worked with us when we were building a new shelter. We identified him. Another was a gentleman who was a longtime policeman in the area, who had his own personal experiences with domestic violence and was recruited to the board. Another person, a couple others were identified by Karen but you need to obviously be open and look. I think if you are in your community, if you're looking for people in the community, including your clients as a potential source, I think you're going to find, opportunities to find people of color.
I think just quickly, because I know we're getting ready to end, maybe it is a part two, because I think that's a really hard question for some people. I think the analysis of race and racism has to be aligned. I think people need to really understand what it is so that they can let go of the uncomfortableness or feeling like, oh, I don't know how to do this. I think you have concepts like give or get. Someone just said give or get, and people don't have give or get. We spent a lot of time talking about wealth, and that people just have not accumulated wealth. People of color have not accumulated. Some people of color have not accumulated wealth, over their lifetime. So, I think there's a lot of ways to look at this. Give or get could be something very simple, very easy. Judy talked about community members. We should have survivors, and we're working on this now, survivors who are sitting on our board who will just transform how, the board will consider many of these issues. Thank you.
And if I may, Jan, so, I've been in that position. I know we have to close. I've been in that position of being named to a board for my role in the community. And when I saw the page in the board guide about give and get, I stopped dead in my tracks because I knew that I did not have that disposable income to simply hand over, nor did I have the connections in the network to get it from. And I didn't realize and recognize that my value was in my role in the community and what that brought to the board. And nor was that cultivated in a way that I understood and knew how to use. So I will close this out, Jen, if that's okay with you. Thank you all so very much, Karen and Tom and Judy and Mo. This was a rich and full webinar that I think we could perhaps look at a part 2 and perhaps drill down a little more, because there's a lot more to talk about. And again, this is a journey that is ongoing. There is no necessary endpoint to this. In addition to getting a copy of the recording, there is also going to be a host of resources for our attendees to access. And it is about reading, it is about learning, it is about, you know, expanding your understanding of the issue of race in this country that is so required. And so some of the resources that we will supply hopefully will lead you in that direction. And again, we thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon and look forward to doing this again. So thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.